Somewhere around 6 that morning, a boy walked into the haymow with a pitchfork and stopped in the doorway, because the whole back corner of the barn looked like it was covered in grey felt. Not cobweb, felt. Thousands of strands layered on top of each other, thick enough that the wood underneath had disappeared. When he got close, the felt moved. By the time his father climbed the ladder to look, they weren't counting webs anymore. They were counting egg sacs. Dozens of them, each one holding what could be 100 more spiders by the time the weather turned warm. Here's the part that surprises most people. No exterminator got called that day. No truck with a tank of chemical spray pulled into the lane. By sundown, the barn was clear and the hay was safe to feed. And the family had done every bit of it themselves, with tools most of them had owned longer than they'd owned the farm. This is how an Amish family took a barn from infested to clean in a single day, using nothing you'd find on a hardware store shelf marked pest control. To understand why they handled it the way they did, you have to understand something about how Amish farms are built in the first place. A barn isn't just a building where you store equipment. It's where livestock eat, where hay is stacked floor to rafter, and where a family's income for the whole year is sitting in one room. You cannot spray broad-spectrum pesticide across a haymow that dairy cows are going to eat out of in February. You cannot fog a barn where a family's goats will be standing the next morning. Whatever gets used on that infestation has to be safe enough to live alongside the animals it's protecting. So the morning started slow, almost deceptively slow. The father sent the boy back down for the rest of the family, and while they gathered, he did something a lot of outsiders wouldn't think to do first. He didn't touch a single web. He walked the barn top to bottom, just looking. Where the webbing was thickest, where it thinned out, which beams had egg sacs and which ones didn't. On a farm, you don't attack a problem before you understand its shape, because attacking blind wastes a day you don't have back. What he found was a barn spider colony that had been building for most of a season, probably starting in a woodpile stacked too close to the wall back in the fall. Barn spiders aren't dangerous. They're not the kind that send anyone to a hospital. But an infestation this size meant webs catching dust and chaff until the beams looked like they were wearing grey coats. Egg sacs tucked into every seam where two boards met. And enough of them that come spring, the numbers wouldn't just hold, they'd multiply into the hundreds. That's when the family split into jobs, and this is where the day actually started moving. The first tool out was the simplest one on the farm. A long-handled broom, the kind normally used to sweep a threshing floor, turned upside down and dragged across every beam within reach. Two of the older children took that job, working the high corners while their mother worked the lower walls with a rag soaked in vinegar. Vinegar doesn't just knock a web down, it breaks the silk's structure, so it doesn't just cling right back to the next surface you touch. It's cheap, it's already sitting in the kitchen pantry, and it's something you can use 6 inches from a feed trough without worrying about what it does to the animal eating out of that trough the next day. The smell alone told you something was different that morning. Vinegar cutting through the usual barn smell of hay dust, sweat and manure. Sharp enough to sting the back of your throat if you leaned in too close to a wall they'd just wiped down. Every few minutes, someone called out where they'd found another cluster, and the answer was almost always the same word back: keep going. But brooms and vinegar only get you the webs you can reach, and in a barn with rafters 20 feet up, what you can reach is maybe half the problem. For the high work, the father brought out a kerosene lantern hooked to the end of a long pole. Egg sacs and old dense webbing near the peak of the roof got a slow pass of low, controlled heat, just enough to singe the silk without setting anything alight, and definitely not anywhere near the loose hay stacked below. That's a job that takes a steady hand and someone who's done it before, which is exactly why it wasn't the boy holding that pole. On a farm, the dangerous jobs go to whoever has the most practice, not whoever's closest. While that was happening, the youngest kids were given the job that sounds the least important and might actually matter the most. Diatomaceous earth, a fine white powder made from the fossilized remains of tiny aquatic organisms, worked into every crack and seam along the barn's foundation. It's harmless to touch, harmless to livestock, but to a spider, walking across it is like walking across broken glass. It cuts through the waxy coating on their exoskeleton and dries them out from the inside. No spray, no fumes, no waiting period before the animals can go back in. Just powder in the cracks where the next generation would try to come in from outside. And then there was the part nobody had to be told to do: the barn cats. Every working AMISH farm keeps a handful of cats, and not as pets in the way most people picture. They're working animals, same as the horses. On a day like this, they didn't need direction. They followed the disturbance, picked off whatever scattered out of the webbing as it came down, and did in silence what would have taken the family another hour with a broom. Nobody logged how many spiders the cats caught that day. Nobody needed to. It's just built into how the farm runs. By late morning, the family had cleared the worst of the visible infestation, but the hardest part of the day was still ahead of them. And it's the part most people watching this would never guess: the egg sacs. A cleared web means nothing if you leave the egg sacs behind, because in 6 weeks you're right back where you started, except now it's warmer and the hatch is bigger. So every sack that had been knocked down during the morning got collected in an old feed bucket, not thrown in a corner, not left in the barnyard, but carried out and burned. A small fire, well clear of the barn, well clear of the hay, tended the whole time it burned. One of the daughters was given that job specifically, sitting by the fire with a rake, making sure nothing rolled loose and nothing smouldered longer than it needed to. Why does that matter so much? Because an egg sac left sitting in a dark corner is worse than doing nothing at all. It's a countdown. Skip that step, and the whole morning's work buys you 6 weeks. Not a solution. That's not a step you skip. That's the difference between a problem you solved and a problem you postponed. By early afternoon, something changed in how the family was working. The panic of that first look into the haymow was gone. What was left was just steady labour. The kind that's less about fighting an infestation and more about restoring a building to what it's supposed to be. They aired out the mow, propped doors open on both ends to let the barn breathe, and started restacking the hay that had been pulled down to get at the webbing underneath it. And this is where the day's work runs into something bigger than pest control. For an Amish family, a clean, well-kept barn isn't just practical. It's a reflection of how they see their responsibility to the animals and the land they've been entrusted with. Scripture gets referenced more in conversation on days like this than most outsiders would expect. Usually something about stewardship, about caring properly for what you've been given, rather than letting it fall into neglect. It's not performative, nobody's saying it for a camera that isn't there. It's just how the work gets talked about at the dinner table that night, the same way it's been talked about for generations. That belief is exactly why the chemical truck never got called in the first place. It was never really about cost, and it was never really about tradition for its own sake either. It's that dumping a broad pesticide across a working barn treats the symptom while ignoring everything the barn is actually for. The cows still have to eat out of that haymow. The goats still have to sleep under that roof. A method that solves the spider problem but puts the animals at risk isn't stewardship. It's just trading one problem for a slower one. By the time evening chores rolled around, the transformation was almost hard to believe against what that boy had walked into at 6 that morning. The beams were bare wood again, the hay was safe. The cracks in the foundation held a thin white line of powder that would keep doing its job long after the family had moved on to the next task. And somewhere in the rafters, a barn cat was probably still finishing what was left of its day's work. No exterminator ever came. No invoice, no chemical smell lingering in the hay for the cows to breathe in the next morning. Just a family, a handful of tools that have outlived every one of them individually, and a method passed down specifically because it works without putting anything at risk that the farm depends on. It's worth sitting with that for a second. In a world where the instinct for almost any pest problem is to call someone and pay them to spray a solution you can't pronounce, this family solved a full-scale infestation in a single day, using vinegar, powder, fire, patience, and a couple of cats who already knew their job better than anyone had to teach them. Was it slower than a truck pulling up with a tank on the back? Maybe by an hour or two. But nothing about that barn needed replacing when they were done, and nothing about it needed a second treatment either. That's the trade they made, not convenience for safety. The two, on a farm like this, were never actually separate to begin with.